Imagine this. You are a young, ambitious figure standing at the gates of power. Behind you is your past full of ideals, virtues, and the warm guidance of your conscience. Before you is a door, heavy and ancient, leading to the chambers of real influence. You reach for the handle and realize it won't open unless you set something down. That something is your innocence. In the modern world, we often glorify leaders as moral beacons, people who act with integrity, kindness, and fairness. Yet, if you were to ask Niccolo Machiavelli, the Renaissance political thinker whose name has become synonymous with cunning, strategy, and even manipulation, he might tell you that such virtues are not only optional but dangerous. Why? Because to Machiavelli, the world is not ruled by ideals, but by the cold laws of human nature. He saw politics as a battlefield where mercy could be a weakness, kindness a liability, and a rigid moral compass a guaranteed downfall. In his view, great leadership often requires dirty hands, a calculating mind, and yes, the ability to set aside your conscience when it stands in the way of survival. Today, we're going to explore one of the most controversial ideas in political philosophy, Machiavelli's notion that to lead effectively, one must be prepared to abandon moral purity. This is not a soft, comfortable lesson. It's a jarring, unsettling look at leadership stripped of romantic illusions. And here's the twist. Machiavelli wasn't simply advocating cruelty for cruelty's sake. He wasn't telling leaders to become monsters. He was instead pointing to something he believed was an unavoidable truth. The rules of the political game are written in ink, darker than virtue, and those unwilling to read them are quickly erased from history. So, the question we'll grapple with is this. Is it truly necessary to give up your conscience to become a great leader? Or was Machiavelli merely reflecting the ruthless reality of his own time? And perhaps most importantly, is this still true today? Segment 1. Machiavelli's world. To truly grasp the force of Machiavelli's radical ideas, we must first step back into his reality, the turbulent, fractured landscape of Italy in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. This was not a unified nation as we know it today. It was a mosaic of fiercely independent city-states, Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, and the Papal States, each locked in a relentless struggle for dominance. Borders shifted with alarming speed. Alliances were formed with handshakes in the morning and shattered by nightfall. Kings, mercenaries, popes, and opportunists all played the same ruthless game. And the stakes were nothing less than survival. Foreign powers, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, saw Italy not as a proud peninsula, but as a prize to be divided and consumed. Armies marched through villages with fire and steel, and mercenary captains switched sides for the right price. Corruption was not an exception. It was the bloodstream of politics. In Florence, the Medici family wielded wealth as a weapon, and even the papacy was tainted by political scheming, treating spiritual authority as yet another tool of earthly power. It was into this volatile world that Niccolo Machiavelli stepped, serving as a diplomat for the Florentine Republic. He was not a distant observer, but a man in the very heart of the storm. He negotiated with kings, courted alliances with unpredictable warlords, and sat across from men who smiled warmly while plotting betrayal. He saw treaties dissolve in a single whisper, promises broken with casual cruelty, and noble causes destroyed by those unwilling to get their hands dirty. From these experiences, Machiavelli came to a sobering conclusion. Lofty moral ideals, however beautiful, were fragile ornaments in the brutal arena of politics. Leaders who clung stubbornly to doing the right thing without adapting to reality would be swept aside, or worse, destroyed by rivals who had no such illusions. To survive in a world where daggers were as common as handshakes, one had to be shrewd, flexible, and willing to see the world as it truly was, not as one wished it to be. And so Machiavelli's worldview took shape. Politics, he realized, was not a sermon delivered from a pulpit. It was not the art of being good. It was the art of holding power, of navigating storms without capsizing, of making decisions that others lacked the courage or the stomach to make. In his mind, morality and politics were separate currencies, and those who could not tell them apart would never survive long enough to lead. Segment 2. The Prince and the Art of Necessary Evil. It was in his most famous and most misunderstood work, The Prince, that Machiavelli gave his unflinching advice to rulers. The book is not a love letter to cruelty. It is a manual for survival in a treacherous age. Machiavelli argued that a leader must be prepared to act against their conscience when the situation demanded it. This was not an endorsement of senseless brutality. It was a recognition that in the real world, there are moments when choosing the moral path leads not to virtue, but to ruin. For Machiavelli, the highest moral obligation of a ruler was not personal purity, but the preservation of the state. If a single ruthless act today could prevent years of chaos, famine, or bloodshed tomorrow, then such an act was not only permissible, it was responsible. If deceiving a treacherous ally ensured the safety of your citizens, then deception became a tool of justice in its own right. If striking fear into the hearts of rivals prevented invasion, then fear was not cruelty, but protection. His most infamous advice remains etched into history. It is better for a ruler to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both. Love, he explained, is unreliable. It depends on the goodwill of others, and goodwill can evaporate in the cold wind of hardship. People love you when it costs them nothing. They abandon you when their survival is at stake. Fear, however, is more predictable. It can be maintained by the ruler's own actions, so long as it does not turn into hatred for hatred. Unlike fear breeds rebellion, in this philosophy, the ruler's conscience was not discarded, but subordinated to a higher duty, the safety and stability of the realm. Morality was not erased, it was redefined. A Jew leader, in Machiavelli's terms, was not one who avoided all wrongdoing, but one who committed lesser wrongs to avoid greater catastrophes. To him, goodness without strength was weakness disguised as virtue. What shocked his contemporaries and still unsettles readers today was not just the bluntness of his words, but the mirror he held up to human nature. He refused to write about how leaders should behave in a perfect world. Instead, he described how they must behave in the flawed, dangerous, and unpredictable world they actually inhabited. And in doing so, he gave us a political philosophy that has endured for over 5 centuries. That leadership is not about innocence, but about the courage to make choices others cannot. Segment 3, the psychology of power. Machiavelli understood something deeply unsettling about human nature. People are so unpredictable and quick to abandon principles when it benefits them. He observed that loyalty often has an expiration date, tied not to honor, but to convenience. The moment someone sees more advantage in betrayal than in fidelity, they will abandon yesterday's promises without hesitation. In his eyes, it was naive, even dangerous, to expect that others would place moral duty above personal gain. For Machiavelli, the human heart was not a temple of virtue, but a marketplace of desires, fears, and shifting allegiance. He saw that kindness could be mistaken for weakness, and that honesty could become an open door for exploitation. If a ruler insisted on being entirely virtuous, they would quickly be surrounded by opportunists, who viewed virtue not as an admirable trait, but as an exploitable resource. This is not because humans are incapable of goodness, but because power itself distorts relationships. The more influence you hold, the more you attract those who want to use it for themselves. Here lies the cruel paradox. While leaders may be judged harshly for acts of deception, brutality, or manipulation, history often remembers them more for their results than their methods. We build statues for conquerors, not for those who lost with dignity. How many rulers have been celebrated for saving the nation while their dark tactics are quietly softened or erased in the official story? Moral purity, Machiavelli warned, might satisfy the soul, but in the theater of power, it rarely secures the crown. This is why his advice still resonates so strongly in the modern era, in politics, business, and even personal life. Those who hold power often face a suffocating choice: preserve their moral purity or achieve their objectives. Rarely can they do both. To succeed, they must live in the gray space between ideals and necessity, where difficult compromises are made in the shadows. In that space, the right choice is often the one that secures survival, even if it stains the conscience. Machiavelli was not celebrating cruelty for its own sake. He was pointing to a reality most prefer to ignore: that in a world of wolves, the lamb who refuses to grow teeth does not last long. Segment for modern echoes. Fast forward to the 21st century. The scenery has changed, but the game remains the same. We live in democracies and constitutional states where leaders are supposed to embody transparency, accountability, and moral integrity. We have ethics committees, investigative journalism, and endless public debates about values. And yet, behind closed doors, scandals unfold, covert deals are struck, and ruthless strategies are executed with precision. The language of morality still dominates public speeches, but the language of survival still dominates private conversations. Whether in corporate boardrooms, high-stakes negotiations, or the backrooms of global diplomacy, the same Machiavellian logic emerges. Leaders publicly champion ethical values to maintain legitimacy, while privately making decisions that contradict those same values, not always out of malice, but because they believe those decisions serve a greater strategic purpose. The public hears about ideals. The inner circle hears about reality. Consider a crisis. A president learns of an impending disaster. If telling the truth risks mass panic and economic collapse, would they not feel justified in bending or hiding the facts? Or imagine a CEO who discovers damaging information about their company. If revealing it would lead to bankruptcy, unemployment for thousands, and the destruction of years of progress, might they decide, in the name of protecting the greater good, to conceal the truth? To the outside world, this looks like deception. To the decision maker, it feels like leadership. This is the heart of the Machiavellian dilemma. The belief that some lies are not only acceptable, but necessary. That certain ruthless acts are justified if they preserve the whole. In the political arena, this logic can mean negotiating with questionable allies to prevent a war. In business, it can mean eliminating competition through strategies the public would call unfair, yet shareholders would call brilliant. And so, centuries after Machiavelli penned The Prince, his observations still echo in every headline about a leader caught doing something questionable for the sake of stability, security, or profit. The tools may have evolved, the cloak and dagger politics of the Renaissance replaced by emails, media manipulation, and data warfare. But the underlying psychology remains exactly as he described. The modern world may flatter itself as more ethical, more advanced, more humane, but when power is on the line, the ancient truth still holds. It is not enough to appear good. One must be willing, when necessary, to do what goodness alone cannot achieve. Segment 5. The moral question. But here's where it gets complicated, and perhaps where Machiavelli's shadow still looms over every discussion of leadership today. It's one thing to describe the reality of power, it's another to be accused of endorsing it. Was Machiavelli a cynic who wanted rulers to be ruthless? Or was he merely the messenger, pointing out the unspoken rules of the political arena? Some historians insist he was not encouraging immorality, but issuing a survival manual. He was like a weather forecaster telling sailors about an incoming storm. You may not like the storm, you may wish it weren't coming, but ignoring it will sink your ship all the same. The political world, in his eyes, was a battlefield, disguised as a banquet, and if you wanted to survive, you needed to be prepared to play the game as it truly was, not as you wished it to be. Others, however, see his writings as dangerous, a kind of intellectual weapon handed to the ambitious. In their eyes, the prince becomes a permission slip for corruption, a convenient excuse for any abuse of power. If the ends justify the means becomes the supreme law, then cruelty can be painted as necessity. Lies can be dressed as diplomacy, and injustice can be marketed as pragmatism. And when that line is crossed often enough, does it even exist anymore? This is the eternal riddle for leaders, one as old as the first throne ever built. Is it better to keep your conscience intact and risk losing everything, or to compromise your conscience in the name of victory? Is the moral high ground worth anything if it leaves you powerless to protect the very people you swore to serve? And, perhaps more hauntingly, once you step into the shadows for the sake of the greater good, how do you ever find your way back to the light? In the private chambers of kings and presidents, in corporate boardrooms and war councils, this question repeats itself endlessly. History gives us examples of both choices. Leaders who clung to their values and were destroyed, and leaders who traded their purity for influence, sometimes saving nations, sometimes dooming them. It's never as simple as good or evil. It's always tangled, always gray. Conclusion: Machiavelli forces us to face a truth that polite society would rather avoid. Leadership is not a moral fairy tale. It is not the story of a pure-hearted hero triumphing over wickedness by sheer virtue. It is, more often, a test of endurance, a contest of wits, and a constant balancing act between strategy and conscience. Sometimes, it demands a willingness to do what must be done, even if it means staining your hands and carrying that burden for the rest of your life. The next time you hear someone declare, "I would never compromise my principles for power. Pause for a moment and imagine them standing at the edge of history with the fate of millions hanging in the balance. Would they still say the same words when every option before them carried a moral cost? Would they still hold the same resolve if refusing to act meant watching their nation collapse? Perhaps Machiavelli's real lesson is not that morality should be discarded, but that morality without the means to act is powerless in the arena of leadership. Purity and power rarely sleep in the same bed. The challenge for any leader is not to choose one and abandon the other, but to carry both, to wield power without letting it devour the soul, to make hard choices without forgetting why they were made. And maybe, in the end, the truest mark of a great leader is not whether they avoided moral compromise entirely, but whether they emerged from the brutal game of power still able to recognize themselves in the mirror